Good day, everyone. Welcome back to our SBD series. My name is Walid Al-Morsi, and today we have a total new topic. We are going to talk about endpoint management. So we have our colleague, Michael Deneen from the Customer Acceleration team looking after the endpoint device management, and we are going to talk about Intune today. So over the next 2 episodes, Michael will take us on a very heavy demo on how to configure conditional access and how to configure endpoint device management, including automatic enrollment for Windows 10 and iOS devices. Now, please don't forget to click like and subscribe to the channel to make sure you get all the future episodes. And let us know if you have any comments or feedback. Now, the next 2 episodes will be demo heavy, as I said before, and hopefully you enjoy it. So now I will hand it over to Michael to start the demo.
Thanks, Walid, and hello, everyone. My name is Michael Deneen, and I work as a part of the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Customer Acceleration team. Today, we are going to be talking about conditional access, device compliance, and Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And with that, let's get started. Today, I'm going to be talking about device compliance using Microsoft Endpoint Manager and why it's important in the context of overall data governance and compliance. First, we'll cover the scenario that this organization is trying to address and the current state of their environment. Then we'll move on to a quick overview of conditional access before moving on to an introduction of Microsoft Endpoint Manager and one of its key features being device compliance. And then we'll dive straight into the demonstrations, which will show how to prepare your tenant for enrolling iOS and Windows devices and assessing them for compliance using compliance policies. Before we get into the portal, let's define the access control scenarios that we are looking to address today. Always start with the business requirements when looking to manage devices and protect corporate data. In this case, the business case that we are looking to address is that COVID research users accessing Office 365 must be using a device that is compliant with organizational standards. So, the organization has chosen to only allow access to corporate data using iOS and Windows devices. The organizational standards that we have defined is for iOS devices to have a 6-digit passcode that must be alphanumeric. And for Windows, the device must be encrypted with BitLocker. If they meet those requirements, they will be assessed as being compliant. The organization for now has chosen not to allow Android devices to access corporate data, but they might allow that in the future. Let's have a refresher of the environment that we're going to be using for this scenario. I've only included components that are going to be applicable for device management. This is the same environment and organization that has been used in previous videos. The Windows devices that the users are using are Windows 10 20H1, the latest release of Windows 10. The Windows devices are also domain joined. Users also have their personal iOS devices that they would like to use to access corporate resources. Okay, so now that we've had a refresher of the environment, let's dig into device compliance. And before we can even talk about device compliance, we need to talk about the main thing that's going to be consuming that, which is conditional access. So conditional access is a feature of Azure Active Directory, and that is at the heart of the new identity-driven control plane. So why am I talking about conditional access first? Because it is the consumer of the device compliance state that we are going to be exploring as we progress through this scenario. So when I'm explaining conditional access for the first time, I always like to boil it down to the absolute simplest analogy that I can absolutely do. The conditional access policies are when this happens, then do this. When the user tries to access this corporate resources, prompt for multi-factor authentication, for example. Let's cover the terminology used in conditional access policies. When this happens is called a condition statement, then do this is called a control. Expanding quickly into condition statements, let's have a quick look at the conditions that are available for us to include inside of conditional access policies. One of the most common conditions is group membership. This is the condition that we are going to be using in our example. For COVID research users, but this could be any Azure Active Directory group. Device platform is also a very common condition, which allows you to specify which platform should be included. If we think back to our scenario, we are only going to be including Windows and iOS devices. There are a number of controls available with conditional access policies, such as enforcing multi-factor authentication, blocking the access request, or requiring a compliant device, which is what we're going to be using inside of our scenario today. Now that I've given a brief overview of conditional access policies, let's put it all together. Based on our scenario where we want to ensure that COVID research users are accessing Office 365 from a device that is compliant with organizational standards, we end up with 2 conditional access policies. Both of these policies will be targeting the user group COVID research users. The first will allow access to Office 365 if the user is using either an iOS or a Windows device and the device is marked as compliant. The other is again targeting the COVID research users, but this time we will block access if the user is accessing Office 365 on an Android device. So before creating any conditional access policies, what I always like to do is actually verify that I can already access corporate resources on the devices that I'm eventually going to be targeting with conditional access policies. So here I am as user 7 on a domain joined device, and I'm going to try to access Office 365. And to do that, I open up Edge and I go to portal.office.com. As you can see, it has already single signed me on and I can access it with no problems at all. Now I'm going to check that on the user's personal iOS device that they can access corporate resources being Office 365. So I'm going to open Safari, and again, I'm going to go to portal.office.com, and I should be prompted for my user credentials. I've just entered my user credentials, and as you can see, the user has been authenticated successfully to Office 365. So now that we've defined the business requirements and mapped out the organizational standards for our iOS and Windows devices to be compliant, let's jump into the conditional access portal and create some conditional access policies. All right, so now that we've verified that we can access corporate resources being Office 365 on an unyet as managed Windows 10 and iOS device, let's create some conditional access policies that will block us accessing those resources unless we're on managed devices. So here I am in the Azure portal. All I need to do is up the very top, just search for conditional access, and Azure AD conditional access will come up. As you can see, I've already got a few base policies in there, and I believe they're actually default policies. So as yet, the state of them is off, so we can safely ignore them. So let's create a new policy. Let's give it a name. Make sure you name it something intuitive, because as your organization goes through and protects more and more resources with conditional access, it can get quite confusing looking at all the conditional access policies. So make sure it's intuitive. Today, I'm going to be calling our conditional access policy SBD Office 365 compliant devices. So because the users that we're going to be protecting with this conditional access policy, the COVID research users, access and use highly secured information or highly protected information, both in Office 365 and their emails and OneDrive and SharePoint, we're actually going to protect all of Office 365. So I'll show you how we're able to do that in this conditional access policy. So to start with, I'm going to target the specific users and groups. And to do that, I click users and groups, selected users and groups, and then find the group that I want to protect. Our group is called the COVID-19 Research Project. Now, whenever you're creating a conditional access policy, best practice is to always include an exclude group. The reason for that is that you want to make sure that you never lock yourself out with conditional access. So we've got a a cloud admins group inside of this tenant that contain all of our admin accounts, and we're just making sure that we're excluding that. So the next thing that we want to do is have a look at the cloud apps or actions that are going to be protected by this conditional access policy. What we're going to be doing is protecting a selected application. And as you can see, we've got a whole heap of applications here that we're able to protect. But for this demonstration, we're only going to be doing Office 365. So let's go ahead and select that and then click OK. Under the conditions, we saw that we only wanted to protect iOS and Windows devices. So let me go ahead and get those. And underneath the grant control, we only wanted to allow access on iOS and Windows devices when they had been marked as compliant. So let me select that grant control and click OK. Now, by default, the policy is going to be set to report only. So make sure that we click that to on and click create. Now, if you remember in our scenario and in our business requirements, we also wanted to block Android devices. So let's go ahead and create another conditional access policy that's going to block access to Android devices when they're trying to get to Office 365. So again, make sure we put an intuitive name, block. I'm going to select the same user group, which is my COVID-19 research project. Again, make sure that we've got the exclude. Target Office 365 as the cloud app. The condition will be the device platform, Android, and the grant will actually be block. Cool. Now that they've been created, let's go ahead and test them and see what happens on our devices now that we've configured those policies. Okay, so I'm back on the user's personal iOS device. I've just closed my tab and signed out of Office 365. Now let's try to access Office 365 again and see if the conditional access policy that we just created is going to kick in and block us from accessing corporate resources. So let me open up Safari. Again, try to navigate to portal.office.com. We should get prompted to log in again. So I've got some saved credentials here. And at this stage, now that we've authenticated, conditional access should pick up our session and have a look at the device that we're trying to access Office 365 from. Because the device is not enrolled with an MDM, it's not able to be compliant. So therefore, conditional access has blocked us from accessing Office 365. Let's do the same test on a Windows device. Okay, so I'm back on the user's domain join computer. Let's try to access Office from this device. So again, I go to portal.office.com. I've got cached credentials, so let's try to sign in. I'll enter my password and click sign in. And again, you'll see conditional access has blocked me from accessing Office 365 because I'm not yet on a compliant device. So what is a compliant device? Let's explore that a little bit further. So before we dig into device compliance, let's have an introduction into the management control plane in Microsoft 365 that provides us with the device compliance data. Microsoft Endpoint Manager is Microsoft's unified endpoint management solution with the ability to manage all device types that you have in your IT estate, whether that's Windows, Android, iOS, or even macOS. Microsoft Endpoint Manager combines Intune and Configuration Manager, along with other tools such as Desktop Analytics, Endpoint Analytics, and Autopilot into a single management platform. Endpoint Manager, as I'll be referring to it from now on, lets us manage the device types that I mentioned, allowing us to configure settings and the security configuration on the devices and deploy applications, amongst many other things. Today, we're going to be using Intune to manage and check the compliance of a device, which is a perfect segue into exactly what is device compliance inside of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So let's dig into what is device compliance. So you might have already come across device compliance without even realizing it. Most administrators' first experience with device compliance is usually when they are configuring conditional access rules for the first time. The screenshot on the right of this slide shows a grant control in a conditional access policy, and that grant control says require device to be marked as compliant. So how does conditional access, a feature of Azure Active Directory, know that the device is compliant? Well, it gets that information from the management authority of the device. Today, the management authority that we're going to be speaking about is Microsoft Endpoint Manager. When the device is enrolled into Microsoft Endpoint Manager, we are configuring what is called compliance policies to check certain attributes of the device and either deem the device as compliant or non-compliant. This compliant or not compliant flag is passed on to Azure Active Directory to be used in conditional access rules, where they are then either allowing or blocking a user from accessing certain corporate resources. So as I said, we're going to be using Microsoft Endpoint Manager to check the compliance state of the device by enrolling the device. But what is enrollment? Well, enrollment means that the device has been configured to be under management by Microsoft Endpoint Manager. This allows the administrator to control and manage the device. So there's really only a few steps to take before you can start enrolling domain joined devices into Intune. First, the device must be hybrid Azure AD joined. Hybrid Azure AD joined simply means that the device is domain joined, but is also registered in Azure Active Directory. For this scenario, Azure AD Connect has already been configured. Once the device is hybrid Azure AD joined, we are ready to enroll the device into Intune. So there's two ways to accomplish this. Organizations tend to use the automatic enrollment method, which is a group policy setting, which I'll show you how to configure in just a second. And when using this, there is no user action required. Alternatively, the user can perform a manual enrollment through the settings on the device, which is called a user-initiated enrollment. Okay, so let's have a demo of how we can prepare our tenant for Windows 10 enrollment and then enroll our devices into Intune. So here I am in the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Administration Center. You can get to there by going to endpoint.microsoft.com. From here, I'm going to be configuring the global compliance settings. And I'll be configuring that so that any device that does not have a compliance policy assigned is going to be marked as not compliant. The reason that I'm doing that is that without this particular policy, devices that we are not checking for compliance and organizational standards will be able to access corporate resource when that's probably not the intended outcome. So to do that, I simply click on Devices, I go to Compliance Policies, and then I click on the Compliance Policy Settings. So by default, it's going to be marked as compliant. So it's going to say mark devices with no compliance policy as compliant. And that's not what we want in terms of our example. We want to make sure that each device is checked for compliance before they're able to access corporate resources. So I'm going to click not compliant and save. Just keep in mind that that is a global setting. Next, I'm going to create two dynamic groups, one that will query for all Windows devices and one for all iOS devices. We will use these device groups to target device compliance policies too. And because they are dynamic, as users enroll their devices, they will be automatically placed into the group and targeted with our compliance policy that we're going to be creating in the next step. So I'm inside of Azure Active Directory. I'm going to navigate to groups. I'm going to create a new group. It's a security group, and I'm going to call this all Windows devices. Its membership type is going to be dynamic device, and I'm going to add a query. So I've already created this query before. So let's type device OS type, and the operator is going to be equals, and the value is going to be Windows. There we go. So that dynamic query will populate this group with all Windows devices. So I can go ahead and save that and create. I'm also going to create a second group for iOS and iPadOS devices. So again, inside of Azure Active Directory groups, I'm going to add a new group. The name of this one is going to be all iOS and iPadOS devices. The membership type is going to be dynamic device, and let's add the query. So the property is going to be device OS type. The operator is going to be equals, and the value is going to be iPhone to make sure we get iOS devices. And we're going to add another expression, and of course it's going to be OR. We select OS type again, equals, and it will be iPad. Fantastic. We can double check our query, make sure it's correct, iPhone and iPad, it is. Click Save, and then click Create. And now we've created device groups so that we can target our compliance policies to them to make sure they're compliant. The next thing that I'm going to look at is Azure AD Connect. The particular setting that I'm looking for is for hybrid Azure AD join Windows 10 devices. So if I click Configure, it's actually under the Configure Device option. So all I need to do is select Configure Device options and click Next. And here's where I can configure hybrid Azure AD join. Enter in your password and click Next. Okay, so because we've already done hybrid Azure AD Connect, the setting to configure hybrid Azure AD join was already configured initially. However, there's some additional configuration and setup that we need to do. So make sure that we've ticked configure hybrid Azure AD join and click Next. We need to check Windows 10 or later domain join devices are enabled. So if this was unticked, simply tick it and click Next. The next thing that Azure AD Connect is going to prompt you to do is to configure a service connection point. And what this does is it writes in the schema in your Active Directory domain where your devices can find the required information for them to reach out to Azure Active Directory and to register themselves. So to do that, all we have to do is to click the tick box next to our forest, make sure that our authentication service is set to Azure Active Directory, and click Add. So once you've entered that in, simply click Next. Let Azure AD Connect check all the prerequisites for us. And then simply click Configure. All right, so now that the device is hybrid Azure AD joined, or at least we've configured hybrid Azure AD join for our Windows 10 devices inside of Azure AD Connect, we're now going to configure that devices that are hybrid Azure AD joined will automatically enroll themselves inside of Intune. So to do that, I'm back inside of the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center, and I click on Devices, click on Windows, and then Windows Enrollment. I'm going to select automatic enrollment, which is the first option, and make sure that the user scope is set to all and that the MAM user scope is set to none. And just keep in mind that I get a lot of questions about this MAM user scope. MAM is another feature of Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is mobile application management. And MAM in this context is applying to Windows devices, not iOS and Android devices. So MAM in this context actually refers to WIP, which is Windows Information Protection. So if you're not using WIP, you can safely set this to none, and it will not affect MAM or mobile application management, otherwise known as app protection policies, on both iOS and Android devices. The thing that we want to make sure is that this is set to all devices and then make sure that that's saved. In this tenant, it had already been configured for us.